morning, if it still is morning. And I want to once again thank Father Gruner and the Fatima Center for letting me share in the exciting experience of being with you at this conference. Yesterday, I spoke about the recent Fatima literature in light of Our Lady's request for the consecration of Russia. Today, I will discuss the remaining works with a focus on the third secret. That part of Our Lady's great secret of July 13th, 1917, which remains today at least partially unrevealed and most certainly controversial. It is interesting to consider these two unfinished aspects of the whole Fatima story from the possible viewpoint of heaven, noting especially Our Lady's timetable. In 1929, she asked for the consecration of Russia, obviously knowing that 1929 would become the most propitious time to perform that action. Afterwards, it would become increasingly more difficult. It was only after Pope Pius XI, who was informed of her request in 1931, decided not to do it, that she in 1944 gave Sister Lucy heaven's permission to write down the third secret. Had Pius XI performed the consecration during his reign, it would have been enough to end with the warnings of the second part of the secret. And after that would come the triumph of the Immaculate Heart of Mary, because no further punishments would have been needed. At the command of the Bishop of Leiria, Sister Lucy wrote down the third secret and entrusted it to him, saying that it could be revealed at her death or in 1960, whichever came first. To the question, why 1960? She had two reasons. Because the Blessed Virgin wishes it that way, and because it will be clearer by then. The third part of the Great Secret would presumably announce new and even more serious reasons to obey her request for the consecration of Russia. It would be more difficult to perform the ceremony in 1960 than it would have been in the 30s, but infinitely less difficult than it would become once the evils beginning after 1960 were unleashed upon the world. The expectation that the third secret would be revealed in 1960 was taken for granted by Catholics during the 40s and 50s. The first two parts of the secret were often discussed and quoted, and always it was added, the third part will be revealed in 1960. It was part of the whole package we believed. As the 1950s unfolded, people were thinking ahead and counting the years, months, and weeks until 1960, when the full revelation would be made known. It is a mistake to think that this was mere curiosity or seeking after the sensational. There was real devotion in those days, and it was encouraged by the priests and the nuns. When the anonymous message came on February 8, 1960, that the secret of Fatima would never be disclosed, the reaction went far beyond disappointment. There was a numbness, an emptiness, a bewilderment, a sense of futility. The worst part of it was there was no explanation, no acknowledgement of the people's expectations or of their faithful devotion. No Vatican official ever took responsibility for the decision. There was no one who could be approached with questions, and from that time on, nothing further was said. The effect was a diminution in devotion to Our Lady of Fatima, as it seemed that even the Church herself was no longer enthusiastic about the revelations. Only gradually, over the next 20 or 30 years, did a quotation surface now and then from some authoritative spokesman that shed some light on the secret. Finally, in the late 1980s, there appeared a huge 3-volume series, The Whole Truth About Fatima, published by Frère Michel de la Sainte Trinité of the Little Brothers of the Sacred Heart. For me, reading these books was like finding a light at the end of the tunnel, a light that would shine Catholic truth on all the confusing developments of my lifetime. I saw all of recent history in an entirely different way than how I was taught. Frère Michel covers not only the story of Fatima itself, but all the various political and historical developments that formed a context for the ongoing revelations, and which were also themselves affected by any sign of response to Our Lady's requests. In reading this book, we vicariously live through the Spanish Civil War, the martyrdom of so many priests and nuns by the communists, and we see how Portugal was spared all these horrors since Cardinal Cerejeira and all its bishops had consecrated Portugal in 1931 to the Immaculate Heart of Mary. In 1938, he renewed that consecration, solemnly thanking the Virgin for her protection so far and begging her to again preserve Portugal from the war already brewing after the annexation of Austria. On December 2nd, 1940, Lucy wrote to Pope Pius XII, "Most Holy Father, our Lord promises a special protection to our country in this war, due to the consecration of the nation by the Portuguese prelates to the Immaculate Heart of Mary, as proof of the graces that would have been granted to other nations had they also consecrated themselves to her." Book 3 of the series, entitled The Third Secret, begins very hopefully with many signs of growing worldwide devotion to Our Lady of Fatima, triumphant tours with her statue all over the world, and on May 4th, 1944, the institution by Pope Pius XII of the Feast of the Immaculate Heart of Mary. But at the same time, Russia was relentlessly multiplying her crimes and spreading her errors, and World War II was devastating Europe. Most enlightening about this book at the time I read it was its extremely detailed presentation of all the evidence of growing subversion in the Church before 1960. Little minor events, subtleties, obscure decisions that led the Church irrevocably toward modernism, ecumenism, and accommodation with the Soviets, which would burst forth seemingly spontaneously at the Vatican Council. It also chronicles the gradual takeover of Fatima and the Third Secret by Rome. Again, all before 1960. It gives us a preview of Popes John the 23rd and Paul the 6th by a detailed study of their careers during the 1950s. Frère Michel even titles one chapter in this section, quote, "The Triumph of the Anti-Fatima Party." When Pope John the 23rd chose to disregard the Third Secret of Fatima, he did not even consult the Patriarch of Portugal, Cardinal Cerejeira. Father Alonso writes, quote, "Simple folk waited up until May 13th, when it was believed that the revelation would be made. Later, people felt a profound disenchantment and disappointment, which did great harm to devotion to Our Lady of Fatima, both inside and outside Portugal, end quote. This third volume, The Third Secret, attempts to unveil the content of the secret as much as possible, offering an analysis guided by these principles. 1, the contents of the third secret must fit into its immediate context, the first 2 parts and the conclusion of the secret, and must be in harmonious accord with the entirety of the Fatima message, whose coherence is utterly remarkable. Second point, the 3 months of interior struggle and veritable agony that Sister Lucy had to face before receiving, through a new apparition of the Virgin, the strength to finally write it down, revealed to us its tragic gravity. Third point, the fact that for 30 years successive popes have refused to reveal the secret must be because of its contents, for what it announces, for what it denounces, which is astonishingly troubling for Vatican authorities. And point number 4, the prophecy of the third secret is being fulfilled before our eyes since 1960. After reviewing some false secrets and false hypotheses, the author ventures that since material chastisements are already predicted in the second part of the secret, the third secret, quote, has to prophesy events of another order, undoubtedly a spiritual chastisement, end quote. He then makes a study of everything that experts had said concerning the content that might follow the words, quote, in Portugal, the dogma of the faith will always be preserved, end quote, including apostasy in the church, the deficiencies of the pastors, Father Alonso's allusion to grave shortcomings of the upper hierarchy, and Sister Lucy's warning about a diabolical disorientation. The devil, wrote Sister Lucy, quote, has succeeded in infiltrating evil under cover of good, end quote. Because Sister Lucy had once answered a questioner about the third secret, it's in the Gospel and in the Apocalypse. Read them. The last section of the book analyzes scriptures concerning the last times and tries to discern how they might correlate with the third secret. This book is essential reading for any Fatima scholar. A momentous turning point in the saga of the third secret came in 2000, when the Vatican, in a great flurry of publicity, claimed to reveal it. The text which they published on June 26th, however, did not ring true in the light of all that was already known from those who had read the secret and spoken about it. Neither did the preparatory announcement by Cardinal Sodano at Fatima on May 13th, or the theological commentary written by then Cardinal Ratzinger. Ordinary Catholics, as well as non-Catholics, felt that at the very least something was missing, and at worst that this too was an attempt to bury or debunk Fatima. Soon scholarly books appeared, which put the spontaneous reactions of so many people into well-reasoned arguments. The first of such books to come out was Father Paul Kramer's 2002 book, The Devil's Final Battle, which he revised and greatly expanded in 2010. This is truly a magnificent book, not only for the wealth of information it contains, but for the depth of its understanding of the complex movements of our time and their historical and spiritual roots. Thoroughly analyzed in this book are 1, the gradual resurgence of modernism in the church after the death of Pope Pius X, 2, the goal of Freemasonry to infiltrate the church for its own purposes rather than to suppress or destroy it, and 3, Masonic predictions about an ecumenical council which would bring about, quote, a perfect accord between the ideals of modern civilization and the ideal of Christ and his gospel, end quote, and that, quote, the liturgy, ceremonial, ritual, and regulations of the Roman Church will shortly undergo a transformation at an ecumenical council, end quote. Bishop Graber of Regensburg warned of, quote, the replacement of the Roman faith by a pluri-confessional pontificate, able to adapt to a polyvalent ecumenism, such as we are seeing established today in the intercelebration of priests and Protestant pastors, end quote. Also discussed is the communist conspiracy to infiltrate the church. At a Fordham University lecture, one witness heard converted communist Bella Dodd expose, quote, the step-by-step battle plan of communist subversion of the Catholic Church. She explained that of all the world's religions, the Catholic Church was the only one feared by the communists, for it was its only effective opponent. The whole idea was to destroy not the institution of the church, but rather the faith of the people, and even use the church, and even use the institution of church, if possible, to destroy the faith through the promotion of a pseudo-religion, something that resembled Catholicism, but was not the real thing. Once the faith was destroyed, she explained, that there would be a guilt complex introduced into the church in order to shame church leaders into an openness to the world and to a more flexible attitude toward all religions and philosophies, end quote. Father Kramer concludes, quote, the new orientation of the church would come to take precedence over the very dogmas and traditions of the church in her teaching and practice, including the message of Fatima, which would have to be revised or buried to accommodate the new orientation, end quote. Then, the Vatican-Moscow Agreement, the Second Vatican Council, and the new orientation of the church are discussed. Renouncing its evangelical mission, the church, according to Cardinal Walter Casper in 2001, quote, no longer understands ecumenism in the sense of return, by which others would, quote, be converted and return to being Catholics. This was expressly abandoned at Vatican II, end quote by Cardinal Casper. But how can a non-dogmatic council nullify the infallible pronouncements of a previous council? Hans Urs von Balthasar had pointed out in 1952 that the church must demolish long-standing bastions and trust solely the shield of faith. So the social kingship of Christ was abandoned. The church's liturgy, theology, and soul were altered just as Pope Pius XII had feared. And finally, the message of Fatima was slated for demolition because it could not possibly coexist with the new orientation. Our Lady, writes Father Kramer, came to Fatima, quote, to exhort the members of the church to defend her bastions in the coming crisis, end quote. She spoke of heaven, hell, purgatory, the Holy Eucharist, the sacrament of penance, reinforcing the very doctrines that had come under attack. She requested the consecration of Russia so that Russia would convert, a pre-conciliar term. Father Kramer then gives a history of, quote, the adaptation, end quote, of Russian Orthodoxy to the Stalinist regime, whereby that church would never criticize the ideology or even the party line of the Soviet Union, and became in effect an arm of the state. The party line, as developed by Lenin, was the common lie told by all agents, so that the lie of one would not contradict the lie of another. By the Vatican-Moscow Agreement, certain Catholic churchmen, cooperating with Metropolitan Nicodim, agreed that the Catholic Church, too, would become a church of silence. Father Kramer then discusses the reorganization of the Curia after the Council, which made the Secretariat of State the center of control in the Vatican, and how Fatima became subject to a party line under the dictatorship of the Secretary of State. In that role, Cardinal Sodano dictated the interpretation of the Third Secret, which was released in 2000, and Cardinal Ratzinger, in a subordinate position in the new Curia, followed the Sodano party line. The way this party line on Fatima played out that day and since is the subject of many pages of analysis. Father Kramer concludes the chapter by citing the prophecy of a French priest some years ago, which begins, quote, "There will be a wicked council planned and prepared that will change the face of the church. Many will lose the faith and confusion will reign everywhere. The sheep will in vain search for their shepherds," end quote. And which ends, quote, "Blessed are they who will persevere and search for refuge in my heart, because in the end, my immaculate heart will triumph," end quote. All that I have said about the devil's final battle is only a fraction of its treasures. The book is a masterpiece, both of research and of discernment. It deserves a thorough study. Another book, which analyzes the Third Secret controversy in light of the suppression of the whole Fatima story, is Mark Fellow's 2003 book, Fatima in Twilight. Although this book takes a similar approach to Father Kramer's book in its extensive analysis of the philosophical and political movements underlying the opposition to Fatima, they each managed to offer incidents, ideas, and perceptions not covered in the other. Mark Fellows is certainly a self-effacing author. There is not a word about him on the back cover, nor a foreword or introduction telling us what inspired him to write it or what his particular objectives are. A great merit of Fatima in Twilight is that it manages to explain many complicated philosophical ideas and movements and their interaction with each other in gracefully flowing prose that is as easy to read as a novel. We come to understand what motivates popes, cardinals, and political figures, as well as the thinkers, theologians, and movement leaders who inspired them. Similarly, we come to understand the various isms better because they are discussed in terms of the individuals who promoted them. Extensive footnotes follow each concise chapter, greatly enriching the narrated material with further episodes and samples. Mark Fellows is also the only one of these authors to provide an easily readable map, allowing us to visualize where Sister Lucy could be found at different periods of her life, and the relationship of such places as Roem and Leiria to Fatima. Besides a thorough recounting of the story and message of Fatima, a penetrating study of the third secret at several points in light of new developments that concerned it, the relationship of the successive popes to Fatima, the increasing suppression of the Fatima message, and the muzzling of Sister Lucy, the author gives us a deep insight into recent history, in particular that of Russia, Portugal, and Spain. He describes the rise of communism, fascism, revolution, and counter-revolution. Among the topics covered in detail are 1. Cardinal Rampolla, whose papal election was vetoed by Emperor Franz Joseph of Austria, and Cardinal Rampolla's influence on the career and thinking of the future Pope John XXIII. Number 2, the troubling praxis of the worker priests and the politics of the Christian Democrats. 3, the anti-Fatima career of Father Danis and Monsignor Montini's connection to him, as well as Montini's connection to Mauritain and Opus Dei founder Monsignor Escrivá. Number 4, Ostpolitik and the turbulent pre-papal career of Monsignor Montini. 5, the mind of Pope John XXIII and the mind of Pope Paul VI. 6, the rise of Opus Dei and Solidarity and John Paul II's connections to them. 7, Assisi, Vatican II, and the papal vision of John Paul II, and, of course, number 8, Fatima and Vatican II in light of each other. Mark Fellows also devotes a couple pages to Pope John Paul I and the mysterious circumstances of his death. Cardinal Luciani had visited Sister Lucy the year before and had spoken with her alone in Portuguese for 2 hours. He left shaken by her words and spoke as if she had predicted his election. Quote, "It is most incredible, and yet Sister Lucia's prediction proved to be true. I am here. I am Pope. If I live, I shall return to Fatima to consecrate the world and the peoples of Russia, in particular, to the Blessed Virgin in accordance with the indications she gave to Sister Lucia," end quote. The author wonders, quote, "Was he murdered for planning to consecrate Russia to the Immaculate Heart of Mary?" End quote. This book, too, deserves a careful study. Researchers should deepen their understanding of the ideas suggested in the text by following the links provided in the ample footnotes. In 2006, the efforts of those promoting full compliance with Our Lady's requests at Fatima received an enormous boost with the appearance of Antonio Socci's The Fourth Secret of Fatima. His original Italian edition was translated into English in 2008 by Christopher Ferrara. Antonio Socci, well-known Italian journalist, television host, author of numerous books, and host for press conferences of both Cardinal Bertone and then Cardinal Ratzinger, decided to write this book right after the death of Sister Lucy, having seen an article entitled, quote, "Secret of Fatima, sealed in Sister Lucia's cell," end quote, in which the world-famous Catholic essayist Vittorio Messori wrote that the third secret revealed by the Vatican in 2000, quote, "far from dissipating the mystery, had given rise to others on the interpretation, on the contents, on the completeness of the revealed text," end quote. Socci decided to contest this claim, defend the Vatican, and discredit the Fatimists, as he called those who question the Church's handling of Fatima. But after meticulous research, he wrote, quote, In the end, I had to surrender, end quote. His book is a momentous breakthrough. It comes from a surprising source, someone in the Italian Catholic establishment. It represents a conversion. And because the author is so well known to Vatican officials, his testimony would have a strong impact on them. He addresses both the issues of the Fatima controversy, demolishing the assertion of Cardinal Bertone that Sister Lucia had confirmed that the consecration of Russia of March 25, 1984, had been done according to Our Lady's wishes. He tears apart the interview of Cardinal Bertone with Sister Lucy on April 27, 2000, in which nothing was written down, nothing was recorded, and there were only 3 minutes of actual words from Sister Lucy to account for several hours of conversation. The prelate could have asked her, Sochi writes, quote, if the act of 1984 is the consecration of Russia requested by the Madonna at Fatima, he could and should ask her to deny formally the many declarations attributed to her in which she had said that the consecration had not been done. And above all, he could and should have asked Sister Lucia directly if she had ever written what follows the fundamental phrase of the Virgin: in Portugal, the dogma of the faith will always be preserved. We are told nothing about any of this. Sochi's book concentrates on the third secret because of a stunning piece of evidence that was shared with him by Solideo Paolini, a young Catholic scholar researching the history of Fatima. Monsignor Lourdes Capovilla, who had been the personal secretary to Pope John XXIII, had revealed to Mr. Paolini that there had been 2 texts which together comprised the third secret. These 2 texts were sealed in 2 different envelopes and stored in very different places. One was kept in the archives of the Holy Office, and the other in a drawer of a desk named Barbarigo in the Pope's bedroom. These 2 envelopes were opened on 2 different days by one Pope after another. The one which the Vatican revealed in 2000 had been stored in the archives of the Holy Office. The one in the Pope's bedroom has never been revealed. This can be verified because the envelope kept in the Barbarigo desk was covered with jottings by Monsignor Capovilla and signed by him. The envelope with his signature is now referred to as the Capovilla envelope, and the one stored in the Holy Office, the Bertone envelope. This revelation showed that both Capovilla and Bertone were telling the truth when they made statements about where the secret was stored and when it was opened, because they were talking about 2 different texts. Sochi goes on to challenge every aspect of the Vatican line on the third secret, which assumes added significance when we remember that he had to convince himself before he could attempt to convince others. Like the expert journalist that he is, his cross-examination is astute and incisive. His argument includes passages unique to his book. He is the only author to cite the explosive interview of Father Malachi Martin by radio host Art Bell when the subject was the third secret of Fatima. Ironically, in this passage, he leaves out the part of the interview which I found most intriguing. Art Bell read to Father Martin a text that had been printed in Neues Europa, which predicted horrible planetary cataclysms, and asked if the third secret were that bad. Father Martin answered, "Worse," and he repeated, "Much worse." The interviewer then asked, "Are you telling me that what is contained in the third secret is more terrible than what I have just read?" Oh, yes, it is. Because what you have just read is essentially the extermination by natural powers. It is as if nature is revolting against the human race. It is substantially what happens by means of these terrible catastrophes and chastisement. And this is not the essence of the third secret, not that which is more terrifying. At the interviewer's astonished exclamation, Martin explained, yes, it goes beyond the imagination. Later in the program, a listener called in and told of having heard from a Jesuit that it speaks of a pope who would be under the control of Satan. Father Martin responded, quote, yes, it seems that this person would have had a means of reading or would have been given the contents of the secret, end quote. Sochi, however, ended this reflection by casting doubt on the credibility of Malachi Martin. And now here are a few other vignettes to be found in the fourth secret of Fatima, which I have not found confirmed in other books. In early January 1969, according to Monsignor Capavilla, they were discussing the third secret with John the 23rd, just elected Pope. Cardinal Cento, former nuncio to Portugal, who had physically carried the envelope to the Vatican in 1957, said to the pontiff, "It is well that you take a look at it. Sister Lucia has approached me. She could deliver a message to the world," end quote. But an alarmed summit met at the Vatican, and faced with the prospect that the visionary of Fatima would reveal to the world something the Madonna had said, by the will of the Pope, there was issued the prohibition on the sister and her substantial isolation from the entire world, end quote. And here's another little vignette unique to his book. Pope John Paul II himself refuted the claim that the third secret culminated with the attack on his life in 1981. Talking to Vittorio Messori in the book interview Crossing the Threshold of Hope in 1994, he said, quote, "When I was shot by the assassin in St. Peter's Square, I did not pay any heed at first to the fact that it was precisely the anniversary of the day on which Mary had appeared to the three shepherds in Fatima in Portugal, revealing to them those words which, by the end of the century, seemed to be moving toward their fulfillment," end quote. Notice that even in 1994, the predictions had not reached their fulfillment. And notice that he said Mary revealed them to the children in those words. On October 26, 2001, Inside the Vatican, along with Italian journals, published an article entitled "Secret of Fatima, Is There Something Else?" in which it said, quote, "News has arrived that Sister Lucia dos Santos, the last surviving visionary of Fatima, sent to the Pope a few weeks ago a letter in which she warns him clearly that his life is in danger. According to Vatican sources, the letter affirms that the events described in the third secret of Fatima have yet to occur, and the letter, was delivered shortly after September 11th to John Paul II by the Bishop Emeritus of Fatima Malaria, Alberto Cosme do Amaral. Sources have suggested that the letter from Sister Lucia encouraged the Pope to reveal the entire third secret," quote. 2 years after Sister Lucy died, on February 13, 2005, Mark Fellows brought forth a beautiful biography of her life, Sister Lucia, Apostle of Mary's Immaculate Heart. This short and very readable book presents the Fatima story through the life of Sister Lucy, and looks at developments from the perspective of how they affected her. It does not reveal any new facts or interpretations. It does not digress into background information or develop in any detail the personalities of characters of other principals in the story. Its great merit is that it brings Sister Lucy's initiatives and revelations together in one place, a tremendous aid to scholars, and it gives her life a coherence, which helps us to understand her as a real person, despite the fact that she was so isolated, so limited by her vow of obedience, and so humble and reticent to talk about herself. Many have wondered over the years, why did Sister Lucy not just reveal the third secret, find some way to sneak it out, after she could see that the leaders of the church were blinded by the diabolical disorientation she so often lamented? While not addressing this question directly, the author helps us to understand a little better just by letting us follow her through her life. She was always prayerful, docile, simple, and joyful, humbly accepting the will of God and of her superiors, modest and self-effacing, in short, a perfect religious. In obedience to the Queen of Heaven, she had learned to read and write and expressed herself quite beautifully in her letters and memoirs. She seemed utterly at peace in talking with bishops and Vatican emissaries, while always doing her utmost to alert her superiors and the bishops, and even the Holy Father, about the requests of Our Lady, and repeatedly urging them to comply. She felt it more her calling to pray and sacrifice herself than to become an active crusader, and she had plenty of opportunities for such sacrifice. Silenced by the Vatican after her interview with Father Fuentes in 1957, she suffered a long, dry martyrdom as she watched the increasing decadence of society, the decline of the church, the repeated failure of the popes to consecrate Russia, and their suppression of the third secret, which Our Lady had wanted revealed in 1960. An ancient meaning of the word martyr is witness. Imagine a witness who was forbidden to say anything for almost 50 years about the very subject which Our Lady had commissioned her to make known. On June 13, 1917, Our Lady had told her, "I will take Jacinta and Francisco soon, but you are to stay here some time longer. Jesus wishes to make use of you to make me known and loved. He wants to establish in the world devotion to my Immaculate Heart." Who would have imagined that that little while longer would last almost until her 98th birthday, or that the last 50 years would be such a continuous Calvary? Sister Lucia, Apostle of Mary's Immaculate Heart, has inspired a great affection for Sister Lucy in the hearts of those who have read it. Mark Fellows has included a collection of Sister Lucy's writings divided by subject matters, as well as the Father Fuentes interview and several other documents. In the same year, 2008, that his translation made Antonio Sacchi's Fourth Secret of Fatima available to English-speaking readers, Christopher Ferrara gave us his own take on the controversy in the powerful book, The Secret Still Hidden. A centerpiece of the book is the continuing debate between Antonio Sacchi and Vatican Secretary of State Cardinal Bertone. At one point, Sacchi asked Cardinal Bertone, "Who, between you and me, is deliberately lying?" Bertone had accused him of misleading the faithful in his book, The Fourth Secret of Fatima. Christopher Ferrara is careful to explain that it is not necessary to conclude that either party is lying, since the Vatican may be using the device known as a broad mental reservation, meaning an equivocal statement or statements made with a qualification hidden in the mind of the speaker. For example, if the Vatican was persuaded that the missing text of the secret is not authentic, but rather only what Sister Lucy thought she heard from the Virgin, they might say, quote, "We have revealed the authentic third secret," with the mental reservation, quote, "but not that part we think is unauthentic." I am very grateful to Mr. Ferrara for giving us a short lesson on the meaning of this distinction in moral theology. He then proceeds to tear apart the entire case of Cardinal Bertone. It is always spellbinding to hear Chris Ferrara argue a case. He is so articulate, a consummate master of words and ideas. His points are presented so simply in terms that make their truth self-evident, and he delivers them with a precision that cuts to the core of the issue. In the written format, this evidence is so well organized and laid out that a layman can grasp at once the essence of his argument and understand how the pieces fit together. The Secret Still Hidden shows clearly that Cardinal Bertone, his Department of State, and the Vatican apparatus they control, in their effort to keep the text of the third secret concealed, have a modus operandi of avoiding unequivocal statements, using mental reservations, and implying what they'd like us to believe without ever saying it directly. Chris Ferrara summarizes Cardinal Bertone's initiatives as, quote, "a series of elaborate presentations which give the appearance of responding to the need for transparency, but which are really exercises in obfuscation," end quote. Obviously, their intention is to conceal rather than to reveal, and truth must constantly give way to serve their agenda. The evidence and arguments of Christopher Ferrara became key points in the Fatima Center's high-powered 2010 DVD, The Secret Still Silenced, in which Father Gruner and a team of Fatima Center experts make a powerful plea to anyone who will listen that the full text of the Fatima secret has not been revealed. Its content contains dire warnings for the whole world, and that obtaining this information should be a matter of crucial importance for everyone. Covering the subject of the third secret from every angle, the documentary is extremely convincing. The Fatima Center spokesmen make an airtight case for their position in each of the chapters. There were even some things that convinced me, conclusions I had never reached before because I had not thought through the evidence in just that way. I will mention just a few. One, that there is a definite link between the third secret and Vatican II. I had often heard traditionalists say that they suspected as much, and then, as we heard, there was that prophecy of the unidentified French priest that Father Kramer mentions in Devil's Final Battle, who said, quote, "There will come an evil council," end quote. But this documentary states that one of the clues to the content of the third secret is the year it was to become, quote, "more clear," 1960. John Venari shows how two quotations of Sister Lucy serve to bracket the council. In 1957, she told Father Fuentes, in 1957, she told Father Fuentes that the devil was about to engage in a decisive battle against the Blessed Virgin. Quote, "The devil knows that religious and priests who fall away from their beautiful vocation drag numerous souls to hell. the devil wishes to take possession of consecrated souls. He tries to corrupt them in order to lull to sleep the souls of lay people and thereby lead them to final impenitence. End quote. Notice that all this is still a prophecy. After the council, she starts talking about the diabolical disorientation that had invaded the church, and about how the devil had succeeded in, quote, deluding and deceiving souls who have much responsibility because of the positions they occupy, end quote. What happened in between her prophecy to Father Fuentes in 1957 and her sorrow over the diabolical disorientation a few years later? Vatican II. Number 2, that the Vatican may have used the device of mental reservation in claiming that they had revealed the whole secret. Sacchi called it a compromise solution, whereby they revealed the missing portions indirectly by pointed references to verses 1, 3, and 4 of chapter 12 of the Apocalypse. Both John Paul II and Paul VI had used these very verses as the theme of their sermons when they came to Fatima. And even Sister Lucy herself recommended these passages to someone who asked about the third secret. The speakers also pointed out that on several other occasions in connection with Fatima, Pope John Paul had based his sermons on scriptural passages which, when taken in the aggregate, warn about apostasy or a spiritual chastisement. Thus, the Vatican could claim, with a mental reservation, that the secret had been revealed in its entirety. One more thing struck me. The spokespersons in The Secret Still Silenced quoted one after another the words of witnesses who gave us reason to expect that the third secret would prophesy a spiritual chastisement, persons who had either read the secret or who had access to Sister Lucy. But they also included the 1931 prediction of the future Pope Pius XII. I am worried about the Blessed Virgin's messages to little Lucia of Fatima. This persistence of Mary about the dangers which menace the Church is a divine warning against the suicide of altering the faith in her liturgy, her theology, and her soul. I hear all around me innovators who wish to dismantle the sacred chapel, destroy the universal flame of the Church, reject her ornaments, and make her feel remorse for her historical past, end quote. They marveled that he had made such an accurate and encompassing prediction of events that would occur in the Church over 30 years later. And, as Father Gruner added, that he had connected all this with Fatima. To me, the connection to Fatima is also, in a way, pure prophecy, because in 1931, Sister Lucy was still 13 years away from even writing down the third secret, letting alone sharing its contents with anyone. A year later, after the Fatima Challenge Conference in Rome in 2010, the Fatima Center published an update to Christopher Ferrara's book in an information-packed pamphlet entitled Vindication, which reported the latest developments in the ongoing debate over the third secret. The pamphlet chronicles what was perhaps the most electrifying event of the conference, the appearance of the co-author of Cardinal Bertone's book, The Last Visionary of Fatima. Giuseppe De Carli was the only Vaticanist to accept Father Gruner's invitation to participate as a speaker, so that there could be an open exchange of ideas between the two sides of the controversy. He used the occasion to introduce a second edition of Last Visionary, now called The Last Secret of Fatima. After his talk, he agreed to answer questions, even though with each question, his position became more and more untenable. Vindication gives the reader a blow-by-blow account of the interchange between Mr. De Carli and Father Gruner, Christopher Ferrara and John Salza, which utterly demolished the credibility of the official version of events. Exciting reading indeed. But the best part is the end. Christopher Ferrara writes that afterwards, in the hallway, De Carli refused to shake Father Gruner's hand. Rather, he embraced him and said warmly, "Thank you, Father Gruner, for the great work you are doing." It looks like I don't have time for the rest, but I will be finishing this on Friday because the last book is Father Kramer's The Mystery of Iniquity. And I will review that on Friday along with two more books that are hot off the press. The new one by Christopher Ferrara and the new one by John Salza. So I hope to see you then. Thank you so much.
I have come to warn the faithful to amend their lives and ask pardon for their sins. They must not continue to offend our Lord, who is already deeply offended. In the final vision on October 13, 1917, Our Lady silently held out the scapular, a gesture which indicates that she wants everyone to wear it.